From awaytogarden.com and robinhoodradio.com, this is A Way to Garden with Margaret Roach, your weekly invitation to dig in and grow.
I've been relishing a harvest of diverse tomatoes, though I only planted 2 varieties in my own garden this year. My virtual harvest in all colors, shapes, and sizes has been courtesy of Craig LeHoullier on Instagram, and he and I are going to talk top tomatoes and tomato troubles and more today. But first, this message.
Underwriting support from Timber Press, your go-to resource for books in gardening and nature. Whether you're a new gardener, a professional at the top of your field, or a reader interested in the wonders of the natural world, their books are there to help you grow. TimberPress.com.
Craig LeHoullier, a.k.a. the NC Tomato Man, is author of the great book Epic Tomatoes, and he's been showing his Instagram and Facebook followers each variety in progress from seed to fruit on his social media streams this year. It's such fun and so informative, and I wanted to know more, so welcome back, Craig, to tell us more.
Oh, thanks so much, Margaret. As it is such a pleasure to speak with you, and I feel like you're one of those great gardening friends
Coops.
I've never gotten to meet in person yet, so we'll remedy that someday. But thanks for an opportunity to tell some of my stories. This is great.
Yeah. Well, I ditto, and I guess I have to invite you to come do an event at one of my garden open days or something, a tomato fest, right?
Oh, I would love it.
Yeah.
We'll talk maybe a bit about that later. It's been kind of a crazy year, but it tends to be in clumps, and this is kind of my slow time, but there is no slow time for a gardener. It's just different things that we do, right?
It's your slow time with lots of tomatoes to eat. So let's talk about them. And by the way, I'll say that we're going to have a book giveaway over on awaytogarden.com of Epic Tomatoes with the illustrated show transcript. People can enter to win, so that'll be good. So just as sort of background, how long have you been growing tomatoes?
Oh, gosh. I guess the first tomato I grew was probably one that my father bought me as a plant when I was probably 6 or 7. And I remember nothing about it except there is a picture of me in that tiny little garden, so I know that it happened. As far as growing for keeps, probably that very first garden after my wife and I got married up in I was at Dartmouth and she was a nurse. We got married, and then we had our first community garden plot that Dartmouth College gave to we had to pay a little bit for it, but wonderful rich dirt. The farmers would come in and plow it up and put in manure. So I think 5 Better Boys and 1 Roma back in 1981.
I remember that era. So your sort of rise to tomato stardom kind of had something to do with what became Cherokee Purple, a really beloved tomato now. But right, so you were the person.
Yeah, so anyone who knows me, and we may have talked about this, I really get bored with just the same old thing. Even if the same old thing isn't ordinary, it's just I like variety and I love change and I love new things. So it was probably the discovery and joining of Seed Savers Exchange in 1986 that opened the door to this world of heirlooms to me. But it was really the good fortune of having, Mr. John Green of Sevierville, Tennessee, decide out of all people in the country to send me a small packet of an unnamed purple variety with the little history and the letter, the Xerox of the letter he sent me is in the back of the book Epic Tomatoes, if anybody wants to look at it. But essentially just said, the Cherokee Indians passed it on in my area to friends who passed it on to me, and I'm passing it on to you. And, in preparation for this show, I actually dug out a 1993 Southern Exposure Seed Exchange catalog because this is the 25-year anniversary of Cherokee Purple appearing in a catalog for the first time ever.
And one of my favorite catalogs, sentimentally, even though I'm not a Southerner, I've always loved and admired that, the ethic of that collection of seeds. So,
So Jeff McCormick wrote this tiny little paragraph. Essentially, it said, pre-1890 Tennessee heirloom reportedly of Cherokee Indian origin, introduced 1993 by Southern Exposure. Large fruits, 10 to 12 ounces, smooth with slightly ridged shoulders, ripens to a unique dark dusky pink, sometimes called a black tomato. The color carries through. For the more adventurous, $2.25 a packet, limit 1 per order.
Ooh.
So that was its debut, and it blows the mind. It blows my mind to think that in those 25 years, the tentacles of Cherokee Purple have probably reached any significantly sized farmer's market all
Yeah.
around the country. And to
Yeah.
see that,
Yeah.
how serendipitous is
It's
that to have
pretty
happen, you know?
great stuff. And so here we are, 25 years later. First of all, back then there was no
Yeah.
Instagram. So here I am this year, and I've been at it as long or longer, like you, gardening and so forth, and watching things evolve and, watching things like Seed Savers happen and all that in the
Yeah.
years since. But, there was no Instagram. But here I am this summer watching you post a potentially Cherokee green tomato on your Instagram and giving us like up to the minute, like how it's going. Is this going to be a really
Yeah.
good tomato, et cetera? So tell us about that. So this sort of Cherokee line.
Yeah, so out of Cherokee Purple. And this is really why I think that, the big kahuna of tomatoes who lives out there in the spirit world decided that he just wanted to tap me on the shoulder and be one of the guys who has the strange, or girls or people who has the strange things happening in my garden that I get to share. So, so 1995, growing a bunch of Cherokee Purple, and a chocolate colored variant comes out. That's Cherokee Chocolate. Save
Uh-huh.
Seeds Stable. Cherokee Chocolate's born in my Raleigh garden, 1995. A few years later, growing out a whole slew of Cherokee Chocolate, one of the plants gave these incredibly delicious, large, green when ripe tomatoes. Cherokee Green was born. So Cherokee Green now is celebrating really its 21st year of
Oh,
being around. Cherokee Chocolate had its 19-year birthday. But what's fascinating about these is if you grow the plants together, the plant habit is the same. They all tend to tolerate foliage diseases better than many of the other varieties I'm growing. They laughed, they chuckled at the Raleigh heat and humidity and set tons of fruit when many of my other varieties were not. And I hope that we get to talk about this in a minute, but when you grow, let's say, your 25 favorite indeterminate varieties in the type of weather we have, you really do get a sense of which varieties can tolerate particular conditions better than others. So I've had a fascinating ability to compare.
yeah.
Some plants I have a 4-foot gap where there's no tomatoes on. They dropped all their blossoms. Red Brandywine, there are no gaps. Those tomatoes set all the way up the plant. Same with Nepal before it met its untimely demise.
Demise.
The Cherokees are all setting fruit all the way up.
Yeah.
Dester, all the way up the plant. Valuable information, because then I can share with people and say, yeah, it may be hot and muggy where you are, but here's a few varieties that will be able to excel for you even in those conditions, and you'll get good fruit set out of it.
Yeah, so generally, just I want to talk more about Cherokee Green a little bit, but
Yeah.
just to say, so for people who don't know, weather, sort of mechanical failure can happen with pollination and therefore fruit set, or even if it gets pollinated, I guess sometimes the fruit doesn't develop. Too hot, too violent weather, too cold, lots of things can affect, right? And this isn't just tomatoes, this is plants in general, fruiting plants in general, yes?
Yeah, and what I've started to do, Margaret, is look at each variety of plants. Because people like to group. They'll say, white tomatoes taste like X, yellow tomatoes taste like
Right.
Y. What I've learned through the years, and it's not, like you say, it's not just tomatoes, it's pretty much everything. It's like people. We have blonde hair or brown hair or blue eyes and brown eyes. We have a genetic makeup. Each variety has a unique genetic makeup that will make it either happy or unhappy with the conditions in your garden, either this year or
Mm-hmm.
every year, or maybe just the weather, or maybe what you're feeding it, or maybe the way that you're growing it. So it's very tough, I know, to generalize. And those gardeners who really want specificity, this may be one of the frustration points with gardening. But for those of us who love the adventure and
Yeah.
maybe the fact that you don't know all the answers, even after gardening 37 years, I feel like a dummy out there because it's like, oh, that's why that happens. Or, geez, I thought this would work, but it didn't. Just, an endless, a hobby where there's infinite discovery, you can never become bored of.
Yeah, I agree. Well, with Cherokee Green, I loved what you said. I think it was on Instagram. It said, "This tomato blows many reds out of the water." You said, and so in other words, it's green fruited, but it tastes as good or better than a lot of red tomatoes. You said, I don't know why anyone bothers growing Aunt Ruby's German green, malachite box, or even green zebra. And then you said in parentheses, oh yeah, the stripes.
Yeah, and apologies to Tom Wagner and apologies to those who love Aunt Ruby's green, because this is just my opinion. And one of the things I've learned about social media is, I'm going to be okay kind of sharing my views, but I'm going to have no expectations whatsoever that anyone out there will agree with me all the time or even some of the time. And that's half of the fun, is you get into this kind of, and I'm having one on Twitter right now where a fellow gardener has had very poor luck with Cherokee Purple, but what they describe, I suspect they don't have the authentic strain.
Right.
We could do a whole
Well,
show
and that's
about how
exactly.
the prevalence of seed saving has been wonderful on one hand, and really proliferated the availability of mistakes and misnamings
Right.
and crosses
Right.
and all kinds of stuff. So
Right.
you got to be careful what you complain about, because you may not be growing what you think you're growing.
Well, and what I always say is a brandy wine isn't a brandy wine isn't a brandy wine, meaning
not at all.
Depending on where the seed for various generations that you got, where that came from, how it was selected, cared for, etc., and grown out over the generations, and what climate and what conditions, all this adaptation happens, or genetic drift happens, and it degrades, and it ain't what it used to be.
I think what's happening is a lot of gardeners don't realize it, but they're doing their own selecting. I've had friends that
they're saving seed, and they're inadvertently shifting a little bit away from the true type.
Yeah, they may be planting 15 Cherokee Purple plants, and they know that their CSA customers want larger fruit.
Yeah.
So the bees have got in there and polluted their genetics a little bit, but all of a sudden, lo and behold, a Cherokee Purple comes out that's got these big, perfect fruit. Now, you cut that and taste it. I could look inside and say, that's not the right arrangement of seed cavities, or taste it and go,
because you're Mr. Tomato.
Well, it's if you've been there from the beginning on some of these, then you know. And actually, sometimes people will select for an appearance because they're trying to sell a product. They forget something. They forget the very same thing that a lot of our commercial tomato producers. You can make a perfect-looking tomato that will sit in a store for a while, but don't we, after all, want to eat these? Don't we want to crave them? So don't forget the flavor as you're actually. And I think you may mention it, but Lillian's Yellow, which I think is sublime, is really ugly this year. And I was so proud to put a picture of this ugly heirloom and describing the fact that I cut around the cracks, because I love the flavor so much that its ugliness and cracks and having to carve around the bad spots doesn't bother me in the least, because that's my seed saving area, where all the cracks are.
Right. So you know a lot of tomatoes, but nevertheless, there are always some, and this year on your Instagram and so forth and Facebook, I see some that are sort of newish to you. You mentioned kind of one of them, Dester, Dester. Tell us just quickly a little bit about Dester, because it's catching your attention.
Where it first caught my attention is I was delighted to be invited to the Seed Savers tomato tasting some years ago. I think it might have been 2013, 2014. They had just received Dester from someone who received it from a housekeeper for a German doctor whose family brought it over from Germany. So again, it's got one of these kind of convoluted, Ellis Island type stories where it's making the trip and it gets here. They had it in their tasting. They had only had it for that year, and they grew it in their test garden. There were 100 tomatoes that day, and Dester pretty much wiped the floor. So I said, pretty please, I've got some friends at the Seed Savers Exchange. I would love a sample of Dester to try. They sent me some seed, and its excellence just knocked me over. So one of the large oblate shaped, which means it's kind of flattened pink tomatoes, a look-alike for Brandywine or Polish or Stump of the World or German Johnson. But the flavor is incredible. And again, I know that German Johnson is the beloved North Carolina heirloom. I would not let a German Johnson on the same table that Dester was sliced upon, because to me, maybe one is Dester's ranked in my top 10 for flavor. German Johnson doesn't even make my top 250.
Oh,
that's Craig LeHoullier's taste buds speaking. But the German Johnson has what I call a musky, funky flavor. And Dester just tastes like a drive with your grandparents in the country to pick up a tomato when you're really young. You get home, you have the cookout, you slice it, the juice drops down your chin, and you're in tomato and cookout heaven for
Heaven.
that day.
So,
Right?
yeah, so you've mentioned a few big ones that have gotten high ratings for you so far this year. What about little guys, cherries? Are you still a sun gold worshiper? Because I know we've talked about sun gold, which I love as well.
Yeah, I worship sun gold, and I've now had 2 years where growing in straw bales, it has just not done well.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't know if I'm picking up bad luck. In other words, the bale that I've decided to grow sun gold in, it just has had
Okay.
some issues with it,
Okay.
or its roots don't like the heat of North Carolina and the plant just doesn't do well, or I've got an issue with the seed that I'm growing, and it
Mm-hmm.
is a hybrid. I got it from a reputable company.
Me
So
too, yeah.
the sun golds I'm picking, I'm really enjoying, but I've got a cherry called egg yolk that it's one of tomorrow's heirlooms. It's one that emerged at the scene again. Seed Savers tomato tasting. They had it as a test variety. I believe the same person who was involved with bringing Dester to the attention to the Seed Savers was also responsible for identifying egg yolk growing as a sport in his garden, an unexpected result growing amongst a collection of green fruited, large fruited varieties. So the tomato gods again said, we need to get this little yellow cherry tomato down there somewhere. We're not going to tell you how it was made, whether it was a bee or mutation. It's larger than sun gold, maybe by a quarter inch. It's meatier. The flavor is really, really good, and
Oh,
it has become our main snacking
oh,
tomato.
good. Okay,
And
egg yolk. We'll
yeah,
be on the lookout. Yeah.
yeah, and I actually used it to make a trapanese sauce, which is essentially a cherry tomato pesto using toasted almonds and basil that Lydia from Lydia's Italian Cooking on PBS, she popularized it in one of her shows, and it's
Lydia
become our favorite
Bastianich,
pesto,
yeah?
actually.
Lydia Bastianich?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's called Anna's spaghetti recipe, as she calls it, but it's a pesto called Trapanese, Trapenese. It's
Okay. We'll try to find a link for people to that. But
yeah,
okay, we've talked a little bit about some tomato troubles along the way, things that happen, and maybe it's the seed or maybe it's the straw bale wasn't good or whatever. Um, some of the we talked about pollination maybe not happening or fruit set not happening. What about like blossom drop? Let's talk about a few tomato troubles. Just give us your sort of quick 101 on some of the things that people can experience.
sure.
You know?
So the first is going to be absolutely early in the season when you want your tomatoes to blossom and set fruit. The emails come in the spring saying, my plants look healthy, but I don't have a single tomato on them.
Right.
And I'll often say as a response, have you seen flowers? And they're just not there anymore. And if they say no, I'll typically ask, how much sun is your plant getting?
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, 3 hours. And then I'll say, well, what kind of fruit size are you expecting? And they'll say, well, a pound. I'm saying, okay, well, you have planted a great variety in the wrong location
Yeah.
for it to succeed, because big fruited tomatoes really need that 6 to 8 hours of direct sun, or else they're just not going to blossom very much. But
Right.
if you've got a variety and it is blossoming and they're losing those blossoms, then that particular variety is experiencing conditions that is not good for it to pollinate, whether it's too cool, whether it's, as you said earlier, too hot, too humid. And so what I'm suggesting to people is don't prune off all your suckers, be patient, because eventually that plant will flower at a time when it's better for it,
Mm-hmm.
or gently flick those open flower clusters with your fingers, not to
Say that
knock
10
the flowers
times
off.
fast without stopping.
Yeah, flick your blossoms if you dare. If you've got an electric toothbrush, go and buzz your blossom clusters, because what you're trying to do, since tomato flowers are perfect, meaning the anthers have the pollen, and as they
Right.
open, the anthers brush against the style, which is the tip of the pistil, pollination happens, and the fruit of the tomato is the tiny little ovary at the base of the pistil that then swells if pollination happens successfully. And a lot of times if you buzz those blossoms, I'll get the question where people will say, I'm really concerned about my tomatoes because I don't see any bees anywhere. And I'll say, well, You've got perfect conditions for tomatoes for seed saving because lack of bees means you're not going to get crossing. However,
exactly.
you may find issues with your cucumbers and your squash and your melons or any of those crops where bees are a necessary part of the equation to bring the pollen from the male flower to the female flower, separate areas on the plant. So those really are, it's patience, it's flicking your blossoms, and it's making sure that you're growing varieties that are appropriate for your climate.
You heard it here first, folks. You got a blossom flick.
That's right. The famous LeHoullier blossom flick. Will not be an Olympic sport. No
Cracked fruit is something else people ask me. And then also the rings that go around the top on the shoulders, kind of. Cat facing, I guess. Is that cat facing? Is that what I mean to say? I make up things sometimes.
Yeah, well, you've got a whole list of fruit imperfections.
Yeah.
And so there's two types of cracking. When they essentially are concentric with the stem of the plant, it's called concentric cracking. And when they radiate out from the stem, they're radial cracking. There is a genetic predisposition to one type or the other. Some of the Rutgers types or the Marglows types or the commercial medium-sized reds that were used in the canning industry tend to do the concentric cracking. And the big heirlooms, of course, do those big gashes that radiate out. It's uneven watering. And usually it's that tomato is trying to grow, and all of a sudden we get a dry period, and the skin division slows down and the fruit expansion slows down, and then you get a 2-inch thunderstorm, or you go out with your hose and you give that thing a big gulp.
Right.
The tomato swells, the skin can't divide in time, pop goes the little split.
Yeah.
Early splits tend to heal over, and one of the reasons I tell people get the fruit off the plant when a tomato is half ripe or maybe a little bit more is it won't be as attractive to critters, because if you put a dead ripe tomato on the vine out in the garden, the deer will smell it, the squirrels will smell it, things will go after it.
Mm-hmm.
I find if you pick a tomato that's half ripe, because tomatoes do essentially start ripening from the inside, and what you see in the outside happens last of all, just leave them in the house for a few extra days. You'll minimize your cracking. Pick fruit, particularly if you've got a big thunderstorm coming and you've got those half-ripe tomatoes out there, get them in the house and you'll be able to minimize that cracking. Now, cat facing is more, you have a large fruited variety where the temperature is a little bit cool, something's not quite going right. You get a really funny cell division happening, and the bottom of the tomato at best will look like it's got an innie belly button, and at worst will look like, Jackson Pollock decided to take out and do wicked artwork on the bottom of your tomato.
I don't have any of those, thankfully, this year so far. So we're getting down to like 2 minutes, and I want to just ask you, what are the last couple of things that you've eaten tomato-wise? I know you have these like events and you do these dinners and all kinds of things, but what's your like tomato sandwich? Mayonnaise, salt, piece of white bread?
No. It's sharp cheddar, a really good crusty whole wheat bread, and a big slab of one of my favorite tomatoes, grilled until it's crusty on the outside and the inside is kind of melting. The cheddar is melting into the tomato. So grilled tomato and cheese, that was our lunch 2 days ago.
Good.
Last night, our dinner, on Instagram, I put a 2-pound Dester the other day. I took a picture of it.
I saw that,
Yeah, we sacrificed it. I sliced it. I layered it with a red brandy wine, slices of fresh mozzarella, some shreds of basil, little olive oil, Parmesan Reggiano, salt, pepper. That was dinner. And that's, so when you have great tomatoes, do the least to it, because what you really want to taste is the tomato.
Celebrate the tomato, really.
Yeah, and if you've got mediocre tomatoes, that's when you make your sauce. That's when you make your salsa. That's when it doesn't matter if you're going to have the best tomato in the world in there. You just want a tomato. So.
Well, Craig LeHoullier, I love talking to you, and I am inviting you up here. Next year, you're coming up here, so watch out. I'll be on the phone to you later about that. But thank you so much for telling us about what's been going on in your tomato garden this year.
Always a pleasure. You're one of my gardening heroes, and we will meet someday. And thank you so much for all that you do for this wonderful hobby.
Oh, you're welcome. Ditto.
Underwriting support from Timber Press, your go-to resource for books in gardening and nature. Whether you're a new gardener, a professional at the top of your field, or a reader interested in the wonders of the natural world, their books are there to help you grow. TimberPress.com.
Thanks to all of you for listening too. Now, don't miss an episode. You can subscribe free to the podcast version on Stitcher or iTunes. Find me anytime at awaytogarden.com or Facebook or Instagram /awaytogarden. And happy gardening meantime. And don't forget, enjoy your tomatoes.
Away to Garden with Margaret Roach is a joint production of awaytogarden.com and the smallest NPR station in the nation, Robin Hood Radio.